At last, your 2-day hike is over. You stretch, rub your eyes, and finally look up at Firetop Mountain. The very mountain itself looks menacing. The steep face in front of you looks to have been savaged by the claws of some gargantuan beast. Sharp, rocky crags jut out at unnatural angles. At the top of the mountain, you can see the eerie red coloring, probably some strange vegetation, which has given the mountain its name. Across the clearing is a dark cave entrance. You peer into the gloom to see dark, slimy walls with pools of water on the stone floor in front of you. The air is cold and dank. You light your lantern and step warily into the blackness. Cobwebs brush your face and you hear the scurrying of tiny feet. Rats, most likely. After a few yards, you arrive at a junction. If you want to go west, turn to section 71. If you'd like to listen to this intro again, please rewind. If you'd like to learn more about fighting fantasy, then it's time for some Eldritch history. 2022 is shaping up to be a huge year for Fighting Fantasy, the series of game books originally created by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. It's the 40th anniversary. The 4th annual Fighting Fantasy Fest is happening in just a week. We're getting new books by the original authors, and we're getting a special 40th anniversary edition of You Are the Hero, a history of fighting fantasy game books coming to Kickstarter in the next few months. For the listeners unfamiliar with fighting fantasy, it's a series of game books, which are interactive books where you, the reader, would help determine what happened in the story. The most famous example here in the States is Choose Your Own Adventure. There's also game books dedicated to Doctor Who, Dragon Tales. D&D had their own called Endless Quest. There's ones based off King Arthur mythology. The one I grew up with and read the most often was Give Yourself Goosebumps by R.L. Stine, who also had a history of writing other game books. He wrote one kinda game book about the D&D cartoon. It's kind of interesting to find that out. Other game books were about Hero Quest. Nintendo had some. There were some based off Robin Hood or Sonic the Hedgehog. They were all over the place. Very popular for a while. And while a lot of these game books were just interested in interactive storytelling, with the reader being an active part of the story, fighting fantasy specifically came out of the advent of fantasy role-playing games. Reflecting that, in the fighting fantasy books, you would roll up stats and you'd roll for combat and other things in order to determine if you were successful or not, as opposed to just choosing a prompt from the book. Do you want to go left or right? It's like, well, if you want to do this, you'll have to roll for it, which is a cool added layer to it. And I'm kind of upset that I didn't have more exposure or any exposure to this, because as a kid, I would have loved that. I would have devoured all of these books. And looking into them for this episode was really my first exposure to the fighting fantasy books. Even now, it was entertaining. Way more so than the ones I read. Just way more options. It's way better than anything I remember having as a kid. So they're cool. They're fun. But getting a bit ahead of myself, there's a bunch to go through. So like usual, let's turn to section 1 and start back at the beginning. Steve Jackson, Ian Livingstone, and John Peake all met in school and found themselves as roommates in London in 1975 when they decided to make their own company called Games Workshop, which if Games Workshop sounds familiar, they're most famous for their Warhammer line of products at this point. Their goal was to create and sell games by mail order. It was called Games Workshop because John Peake made game boards for things like backgammon and Go. So this handcrafted nature led to Games Workshop. And they were busy in that first year. They started their own newsletter, fanzine, called The Owl and Weasel, and it got enough traction that Gary Gygax sent them a copy of D&D to review, and he in turn reviewed Owl and Weasel in his own The Strategic Review, the precursor to Dragon magazine. And he said it's a little bit small because it was a 4-inch by 5-inch format, but he said the printing was good. It's newsy. There's a lot of games plugged, mentioned, advertised. And on a scale from major tragedy to major triumph, he gave it a triumph. And Jackson and Livingstone loved D&D, so much so that they wound up going to Gen Con and securing as many copies of the game as they could, which I think was only like 6 or something. It was a very small order by, today's standards. But they also secured an exclusive 3-year European distributing license for the game, which is just bonkers to me to have oh yeah, sure. You guys can do all the distributing, which I've heard the story that they were pretty much the only people from England, the UK, or Europe in general to be at Gen Con. So Gygax and TSR were like, yep, here, you guys can have it. Get us over there. And again, this is the first year of their company being formed. So wild. Still that first year, a different group canceled out on a game convention that they were planning for London. So Games Workshop decided to step up, and a few delays, they finally got going on December 20th, 1975, with the very first Games Day, which is still celebrated on that date to this day. There's one coming up December 20th, 2022, which is pretty sweet. So bolstered by the success of that, by getting this exclusive right to distribute D&D, they also started licensing more fantasy role-playing games. And again, this is 1975, so just a year after D&D came out, the first RPG. So they were in on the ground floor, really. So they managed to secure more licensing from other RPG makers. And by the next year, 1976, John Peake decides to leave. He didn't really like going into the fantasy gaming direction. He preferred his traditional games, those backgammon and Go boards that he made. But that didn't stop Jackson and Livingstone. The next year, they changed the Owl and Weasel into White Dwarf magazine, which is still published by Games Workshop today. And in 1978, they opened the first Games Workshop retail outlet. Before that, Jackson and Livingstone have talked about being in their flat that they shared with John Peake, and people would show up expecting to see like a game shop or something based off the mail order business. And they're like, oh, it's just people in a flat. I think they might have wound up getting kicked out of that place because you can't keep having people show up like this. So at the 1980 Games Day exhibition, so after they've been going about all this for 5 years, Penguin Books actually has a stand to promote one of their works, Playing Politics. Jackson and Livingstone meet with the editor, Geraldine Cook, who's really kind of blown away by the surge of fantasy role-playing just showing up in the last 5 years and how many people are here at this Games Day. And she's interested in all this, and she wants them to send in a synopsis of a how to do it book on fantasy RPGs. Basically, this is how you get into the hobby. This is what's going on in the hobby. This is how you play a fantasy RPG. And so while the guys are trying to decide what would go into a book like that, like this how-to manual, they decided, well, we should just make the book a role-playing game, essentially. So they want the reader to just be playing a solo RPG by just reading the book. So instead of this is how you do it, just actually, you're doing it. There you go. Although, funnily enough, Livingstone would actually make that book of how to RPG, basically, which also described the state of RPGs. It's called Dicing with Dragons. And it included a fighting fantasy style game book section as well. We'll talk a bit more about that later. And oddly enough, it didn't get published through Penguin, which is weird, but I guess that's how that worked. So once they decided to make an actual, basically a role-playing novel, their working title was The Magic Quest. And the key concept to make this work was to have meaningful choices that led to branching narratives. So out came the flow charts. And then they decided the most effective way to do this was to split up the story into numbered paragraphs so that your progress wasn't obvious and that upcoming sections would be mysterious. You couldn't just peek ahead, or if you played the game again, it wouldn't be so obvious. Like, oh, I'm halfway through the book, so I'm halfway through the story. Like, no, you could immediately go to like page 300. So a little bit of added mystery and replayability with it. But it also meant that they had to keep track of monsters, items, objects, money, magic, potions, armor, weapons, clues. All of this had to be tracked because now they wrote it all in order, but then later they had to mix it all up. So they had to make sure you could actually win, that you'd actually be able to get what you needed to win. Early 1981, so the year after they met Geraldine, they have a draft ready and they send it into her at Penguin. And the first question they get asked is this a book for kids or adults? And they were like, well, this could be for anyone. Role-playing's for anybody, young or old, it doesn't matter. But that's not quite how publishing works. So the head of Puffin, which was the kids imprint at Penguin, thought it'd be best to target it to the 9 to 12-year-old group. They thought this would be where it would sell. This is where it will do great. But even after all that, Penguin just decides to sit on it for 6 months, or at least they don't make a choice about it for 6 months. And then finally, after that wait, they make an offer. During this time, Jackson and Livingstone were getting a little bit anxious, so they sent off the offer to a different publisher, I think the one that did Lord of the Rings, and they were like, no, we're good. But Penguin finally got back to him. But at that point, they only had 6 months left to finish the whole thing, while they're still running Games Workshop, which is only about 6 years old at this point. So to save time, they decided they'd each just write half of the book. Ian Livingstone wrote the beginning, and Steve Jackson wrote the end. And there was a midway point with a river crossing where they're like, I'll do everything before, you do everything after. Good. And they hadn't been sold on the Magic Quest thing. They wanted a better, more evocative name. And so Livingstone started the adventure off by saying, you're at Firetop Mountain. And Jackson ended it with a fight against the warlock Zagor. So they decided the Magic Quest would become the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. But Penguin was like, well, what does that mean? We need something a bit more descriptive. So Livingstone came up with Fighting Fantasy, which would promise combat in a world of magic and monsters. So that's how we get Fighting Fantasy, the Warlock of Firetop Mountain. So they finally get this manuscript in, and it goes to the editor, Philippa Dickinson. She had some notes. There were some serious issues with the state of the manuscript. The rules were different. While Jackson had the skill, stamina, and luck traits, Livingstone called them combat factor, strength factor, and luck factor. And how they were determined was different depending on the half of the book. They also had different character sheets and combat rules. They had redundancies like a werewolf and a wolfman. And it was pretty obvious to their editor that this was written by two different authors. The tone of the pieces were completely different. So Jackson volunteered to rewrite Ian's portion and clean up everything. And they actually did manage to convince Puffin to let them use illustrators that had worked with them on their White Dwarf magazine, that gaming magazine that evolved out of the Owl and Weasel. Which I read a story about Owl and Weasel, why they called it that. Was one of them years down the road, without any previous interview information to back it up, he was like, oh, it was based off traits that gamers should have. You should be wise like an owl, but crafty like a weasel. Don't know if that was a later, oh, that's why we called it that, or if that was actually their thinking. Or if it's just completely, internet thing. But it was a fun story. So by using these illustrators they had worked with before, it gave the books a uniquely dark look compared to the usually tame children's books that were coming out at that point. So it gave them a little bit of an advantage of, hey, this is something different. So before we get too much further, I want to explain when they cleaned up the book, what they wound up with as the rules that would set the baseline for fighting fantasy to this day. Now, later books would have different factors that you could tweak and adjust. You'd get gold values, or time would be a factor, or any kind of different things. But there's a set formula, the baseline system, that underlines most of the books. So, the very basic, it's in the tagline, you are the hero. It's written in second person, so it's always describing you, the hero, and what you do. And you have 3 traits, your skill, stamina, and luck, which you determine at the beginning of the book by rolling 1 or 2 d6s and adding a base number to that. And your stats can change during the game, usually down. But special items could allow them to surpass your initial scores, what you rolled at the beginning. Skill would be your fighting expertise. This is rolled during your battles. To determine how you did, you'd roll 2d6, add your skill, and compare it to the enemy who also rolled 2d6 and added their skill. Whoever wound up with less would lose 2 of their stamina. Stamina was your general constitution, your will to survive, your determination, and overall fitness. It was your HP, basically. It's your health. The more you had, the longer you could go, the more hits you could take. And your final stat trait was luck, which does what it says on the tin. It's how lucky you are. This would show up in the game by random luck rolls that you would have to make, or you could use it during combat to either inflict more serious wounds on your enemies or take less wounds when you get hit. And luck rolls use a roll under mechanic. So you'd roll the dice and you want to get less than your current luck skill. But every time you tried a luck roll, it would reduce your total luck by 1, representing that even the luckiest, a person will eventually run out of luck. Since you're a hero going on a quest, you're also going to get starting equipment. The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, for example, you start with a sword, a shield, leather armor, and a backpack with 10 provisions, which you could use to heal for stamina. At the beginning, there was only set parts where you'd get a prompt where, do you want to eat a provision? Turn to this section. But later works would just allow you to eat them whenever you were outside combat. You'd also be given a potion of skill, strength, or fortune. And this first book gave you 2 doses, which would restore your skill, stamina, and luck, respectively. And the luck one also gave you an additional point of luck by drinking it. So it sounds like kind of the one to go with. But again, this was just Warlock. Any other books, you'd start off with whatever they decided you'd start off with. Firetop Mountain also established the general rule, but not always followed, that there was actually 400 sections in the books. The story goes that when Jackson and Livingstone brought their different sections together, they counted up all the sections, and there was 399. So Jackson just added a dummy one, section 192, where you couldn't get to that no matter what you did. And I looked at it, and it's just, the only line of text is, go to this other section. So it's like, just straight up is just a dead one, just so they could be, there's 400 different ones. And so a lot of the line would have 400 sections to go to. Just a fun little... All right, so back to the history overall. So at this point, it's August of 1982. So 2 years after they initially met with Geraldine and decided to make a book like this, it's finally published. It starts off a little bit slow, just barely at the beginning. But articles in White Dwarf, and then Puffin had their own book club that got into the hands of a bunch of school kids where it kind of spread like wildfire. The book had to be reprinted 5 times in that first year alone, which made it incredibly obvious that they need more of these books. So Jackson and Livingstone start writing more, this time working separately. If they would have to rewrite it, if they work together anyway, might as well write their own. And then you get 2 books instead of just 1. But soon they had to recruit more authors to get more of these out there. Confusingly, the first person they hire is Steve Jackson. Not the one I've been talking about, but the US game designer, who's most famous for making GURPS and Munchkin. And I don't know if they thought it was better this way or what, but they just decided to just name him as Steve Jackson in the book. So unless you knew, there'd be no telling, like, was this the UK Steve Jackson or the US Steve Jackson? Which is kind of great. I love how both of their Wikipedia pages also have sections of the 2 Steves. Like, he's often confused with this other guy who also works in games and wrote for Fighting Fantasy, and his name's Steve Jackson. But after him, they hired less confusingly named authors like Andrew Chapman, Carl Sargent, aka Keith Martin, Mark Gascione, and Peter Darville Evans. And in an interview to the BBC, Livingstone recalled that the books weren't excluded from the Satanic Panic happening around this period. And he said that the Evangelical Alliance published an 8-page warning guide saying, because children were interacting with ghouls and demons, they would be interacting with the devil. One housewife phoned her radio station and said her son levitated having read one of my books. A vicar also threatened to tie himself to the gates of Penguin Books until Fighting Fantasy was banned. Which, if you know anything about how kids consume stuff, this probably helped them with the sales at the beginning. I don't know about you, but as a school kid, hey, if you read this book, you'll be able to levitate. Sounds great. So yes, the Satanic Panic did not negatively impact the books. And in fact, between 1982 and 1992, dozens of books are made. Most of them are fantasy, but some go into sci-fi, horror, post-apocalyptic, and even superhero genres. In 1983, Steve Jackson writes Sorcery, this 4-part overarching adventure series, so they lead into each other, and you are able to play a wizard along with a warrior. And as a wizard, you utilize these 48 spells, which were represented in a separate spell book. And they were all 3-letter words. So zap would be for a lightning bolt type of spell, or hot would be the equivalent of fireball. And while playing, it encouraged you to try to memorize the spell book and not just look at them while playing, because part of the options, you'd be giving a specific set of these spell words, but some of them would be false. So if you tried to cast one of those, your spell would fail, which is a fun little mechanic. The sorcery also had an added little thing of having pictures of dice at the bottom. So instead of rolling physical dice, you could just flip to a random page and that would be your roll. Which I had read a story about people often just skipping out on the dice portion because if they were reading them in public, for example, it's kind of inconvenient to have dice and roll them. So it's a cool way to get around that. Smart thinking. In between 1984 and 1986, they actually had a magazine to go along with it, Warlock, the Fighting Fantasy magazine, in that it had spells and creatures, and they'd often have a section of a game book, either just a short one or the first 2 had Warlock split amongst them. So you could read the books there, which is cool. Also in 1984, Steve Jackson actually writes Fighting Fantasy, the introductory RPG. We'll get more into the RPG stuff in a bit, but it's funny. Based off RPGs and now has its own RPG. 1985, Jackson also made this picture game book, The Tasks of Tantalon, which had hidden clues in the images of the picture book that would help you solve the mysteries within it. Next year, Steve Jackson designed the Warlock of Firetop Mountain board game, which was published through Games Workshop. Nice little tie-in for them there. 86 also saw a unique release for Fighting Fantasy, The Clash of the Princes, which was actually a box set that had 2 different books in it, The Way of the Warrior and The Way of the Warlock. And it could just function as 2 separate Fighting Fantasy books, or you could play it as a 2-player game. And there was additional traits to keep track of called action and status. And what those were could impact the other player's game, which is kind of a cool idea. Then 1989 saw the advent of Advanced Fighting Fantasy, a new RPG that built off the one Jackson had wrote, but was separate from it. And this role-playing game really did take a lot from the books. You had 4 characteristics, which were skill, stamina, luck, and magic, because it was also built off the sorcery books. But it also added stuff from RPGs. Your character had a race, skills, talents, and a social class. And playing was built off the game mechanics too. When you were trying something in an unopposed check, you'd roll 2d6, and it was a roll under. If it was an opposed check, such as a fight, you'd roll 2d6 and add your characteristics. The higher wins, just like the books. And they also had luck tests, which, again, roll under your current luck skill. This Advanced Fighting Fantasy RPG also had a release of Titan, the Fighting Fantasy World. So a lot of the books were all set in the same world called Titan. And this RPG product built off of it, the various locations and people, and actually detailed and fleshed out the world here. Between 1989 and 1994, there was also 7 novels written. So not interactive game books, just straight up fiction. Jackson and Livingstone wrote these, as did Mark Gascione and Carl Sargent. And then 1993 saw a second board game, this one, The Legend of Zangor, the Warlock from Firetop Mountain. This one was designed by Livingstone and was published through Parker Brothers. But around this time was the beginning of the end for the original run of Fighting Fantasy. The rise of video games meant that kids, the main target audience, were getting distracted by this other form of interactive entertainment. So Penguin decided that they'd end the series with book 50, Return to Firetop Mountain by Ian Livingstone. But there was really strong sales for that book, probably in part due to returning to the classic original location of the first book. And so Penguin decided, hey, let's do 10 more. But there was still the issue of video games. So only 9 were produced. The 10th book, Blood Bones, was shelved and not released. So Puffin Books Fighting Fantasy ended with book 59, Curse of the Mummy, in 1995, which was written by Jonathan Green. And this whole interaction with the video game industry is kind of ironic because Livingstone and Jackson would go on to have pretty decent employment in the video game industry. Plus, Fighting Fantasy and sorcery books go way back when it comes to interacting with video games. They had ones released on the Commodore 64, computers, PlayStation, PlayStation Portable, Nintendo DS, Nintendo Switch, and even to today on mobile, which actually, if you haven't checked out, there's some really cool ones. This company, Inkle, has released a mobile version of the sorcery books. And then Tin Man Games has Fighting Fantasy Classics for both computer and mobile. This was how I read my first Fighting Fantasy book. You can get Blood Bones for free, a bit more on the release of that in a minute. And they also have a great history section that you can read too. A lot of the info for this podcast actually came from their little intro section. Also on mobile, it was really cool for you didn't have to keep track of your gold or the time passing or anything. So it was really convenient to be like, oh, I choose this one. And then it wouldn't let you, if you came to a choice that was, if you have this item, you can go here. Or if you haven't been here yet, you can go to this direction. Or did you win the fight? Did you lose the fight? And being a program, it actually would only allow you to do the ones that you could instead of, did I do that or not? And if you haven't checked it out, again, Tin Man Games Fighting Fantasy Classics. You can read Blood Bones for free. It's really cool. All right, going back in time. So Fighting Fantasy ends production in 95. kind of lays low for a while. But in 2001, Icon Books is entering the kids' book market with their Wizards Books imprint. Similar to Penguin and Puffin, we got Icon and Wizard. And the publishing manager, Simon Flynn, he knows that Fighting Fantasy is the perfect series to break into this market. They've been left alone for 6 years now and thinks that this generation of kids would eat these books up. So he actually manages to track down Steve Jackson's email and they strike a deal. And there's a great little story that they met at a restaurant and that they played a game of spoof in order to determine what their final advance was, and that Steve and Ian won this game, which of course they did. By 2002, Wizard Books has acquired the rights to release Fighting Fantasy, and they put out 30 titles between 2002 and 2007. Most of these are re-releases. They include the sorcery books into it. Before that, they were kind of the separate thing. This time they're right in there. But they're also put out 3 new books. Ian Livingstone releases I, the Dragon, which, although a new book, it's actually just an expanded version of the game book story from his Dicing with Dragons How to RPG book, which is kind of an interesting thing. And the other 2 new books were written by Jonathan Green, a previous Fighting Fantasy author as well. He would finally get to bring Blood Bones to life about 12 years after it had been proposed and then shelved. And he also wrote Howl of the Werewolf, which the story goes that he noted that werewolves, like I mentioned in Firetop Mountain, there was 2 different wolfman-werewolf encounters. He noticed that they were kind of just this sideline random encounter in the books, and he wanted it to be like, this is the big bad, it's all about the werewolves. And I've seen that it's been rated as one of the best Fighting Fantasy books out there. There was like a fan poll, and it got top slot, which is really cool. But it also has the dubious distinction of, once again, being the last in the line for Jonathan Green. 2 for 2, the end of the line. He was the last book. But it's only last if you don't count the Warlock of Firetop Mountain 25th Anniversary Edition, which is actually really cool. It was the first Fighting Fantasy to be released in hardcover. It's got a section where Jackson and Livingstone detail the origins, and they include the first page of the draft for the Magic Quest. There's a brief history of the series. They print out Livingstone's map of his half of the adventure. There's Fighting Fantasy trivia. They also, for the first time ever, they put out The One True Way, the solution. It might be the only time they printed the solution. I didn't see anything else about any of the other ones. And this practice, I've heard them mention in interviews, kind of led to this black market of solutions for the games of how to best get through. So kids on playgrounds being like, hey, I got this. This is how you do it. It's kind of a funny idea. The Anniversary Collection also had a fold-out map of the inside of Firetop Mountain. And it appears to be a collector's thing at this point, because the only copy I could find for sale was going for about $600. So like, that's cool. No. So while Wizard Books is putting out this new line, some of the books are also adapted to the D20 system based off of Dungeons & Dragons by Jamie Wallace. He adapts both Fighting Fantasy and Sorcerer books to that RPG system. And in 2009, Wizard decides to relaunch their Fighting Fantasy and Sorcery books with more reprints, once again starting with Warlock of Firetop Mountain. But again, we get a couple new ones. Jonathan Green once again writes 2 new books, The Storm Slayer and Night of the Necromancer. And Ian Livingstone comes back to write Blood of the Zombies. The story for this one goes that his time in the video game industry taught him that what kids like is zombies. It also was designed to be more fast-paced and more action-packed. But once again, the Wizard line of Fighting Fantasy comes to an end, this time in 2012. Just around that time, 2011, Orion Games actually updates Advanced Fighting Fantasy, the RPG system, and they still got stuff in print, which is pretty cool. And they've been teasing a new release of something coming out that they're going to announce at Fighting Fantasy Fest. So I'm curious to see what that was. There was this mysterious box on their Twitter. I was like, ooh, what could this be? And then starting in 2014, Jonathan Green, author of multiple Fighting Fantasy books we've talked about, actually puts out You Are the Hero, a history of Fighting Fantasy game books. Part 2 came out in 2017. And then, as I mentioned at the beginning, the 40th Anniversary Edition, which it seems to combine both of them, is going to come to Kickstarter later this year. So definitely already got set up to be notified when that launches, because I'm excited for that. 2016, we got some coloring books based off some of the classic adventures. In 2017 was a pretty big year for fighting fantasy. Ian Livingstone's Freeway Fighter, one of the books, was turned into a comic by Titan Comics, who are best known for tie-in works. They do a lot of movie and TV tie-in comics. 2017 also saw the launch of some audio dramas based off the books. Currently, there's 5 works released, and these ones are put out by Fox Yason Productions. And most importantly, 2017 saw a new publisher with Scholastic, who started once again reprinting a bunch of Livingstone and Jackson's books, including the Sorcery line. They're up to about 20 now. I think 19, and we're about to get 2 more. But they also had new artists, which I'm not sure how I feel about that one. They updated all the art on the inside, which I kind of like the old one, so I don't know. I haven't really seen the new one, but I'm not a big fan of updating art styles. But in addition to new artists, you also got new authors who are writing new books. So we got Charlie Higson, who wrote The Gates of Death, and Rhianna Pratchett, who wrote Crystal of Storms. Which, it's funny, at first I was excited because she's Terry Pratchett's daughter, which is like awesome. Terry Pratchett of Discworld fame. But actually, her own credits got me way more excited for her writing this book because she works on video games. She's worked on Beyond Divinity with Larian Studios, who's currently working on Baldur's Gate 3. She also has credits for the Overlord series of games, Mirror's Edge, the more recent Tomb Raiders. I don't know if they're the most recent, but that revamped version, which were great games. She also was the lead writer on Bard Song with Steamforged Games, which I mentioned in my free RPG Day episode. This RPG board game hybrid thing that looks really cool. So I definitely want to check out her book because it's like, oh yeah, she's done a bunch of stuff I like. They've also had a few new books put out by Ian Livingstone, The Port of Peril and The Assassins of Alancia. And since it's the 40th anniversary, they started in 1982, it's now 2022, and at this point over 20 million copies of the books have been sold. So to celebrate all that, there's 2 brand new books coming out. One is Shadow of the Giants by Ian Livingstone, and this would be the 71st fighting fantasy book, or the 75th if you count the 4-book sorcery line. And the description of this one is, when an ancient artifact is discovered inside Firetop Mountain, its evil magic unleashes terrifying iron giants upon the world. In a race against time, you must find the only person who knows how to defeat them. And, no offense to Livingstone, but he's come back quite a few times. But they also got a new book coming out by Steve Jackson, which this is the first time he's written a fighting fantasy book in 36 years. So that's really cool that he came back for this. And he's got The Secrets of Salamonis. Traveling to the ancient city of Salamonis to make your fortune, you must decide whether to join the strong arms guarding the merchant caravans that crisscross Alancia or study at the famous halls of learning. Will you enter Bufonfen in search of cauldron weed, or rid King Salomon's mines of the pests that plague it? Will you bring Cardinal Zin to justice, or set off in search of the horn of the black unicorn? And just who is the Shivering Man? And what does he have to do with the mystery of the Screaming Sky? It just sounds awesome. There's so many options. It sounds great. Unfortunately, being in the US, I'm not seeing these guys available for anywhere. Scholastic, I remember loving them as a kid, getting those book fair books, but buying from them now seems a bit of a pain. So I haven't seen anywhere to order them from the US, but I might just order them from a UK importer because these sound great and I want to read them. But we got more exciting stuff coming out this year. Next week, in fact, if you're listening to this podcast right away, we have the 4th Fighting Fantasy Fest, taking place at the University of West London in Ealing, taking place on Saturday, September 3rd, 2022. The guests of honor, Ian Livingstone and Steve Jackson, along with authors Rhianna Pratchett, Peter Darville Evans, Jonathan Green, and Mark Gascoigne, who is also... This fest is going to be the first place you can pick up Marvel's new multiverse missions, which the first 2 are Deadpool and She-Hulk, and they're new game books from Marvel. And Mark hasn't written them, but he is the big brain behind the line of books. They're going to debut them there for purchase, which is a cool, oh, that's random, but awesome. The fact that they chose Deadpool and She-Hulk, the 2 Marvel characters that are most likely to break the 4th wall, makes me think that these books are going to be quite fun. Choose your own adventures of getting them to critique you on your choices. The fest is also going to have the artists John Sibbick, Tony Hugh, Mel Grant, and Rob Ball. And their original commissioning editor, Geraldine Cook, is going to be there as well. They're going to have panels talking about the history and stuff. They're going to have signings. It sounds like fun. I wish I could be there, but London's a bit of a trip from Colorado. Their website says there's still tickets available, but not many. So if you're interested and you're in the area or able to get there, check it out. But so far, that's all I got for Fighting Fantasy. Looking into these for this podcast is really my first exposure to the line, and it's really great. Like, my first book was on the app, so Blood Bones, that long-delayed book. I did not do great my first run through. You're trying to stop the resurrection of the pirate Blood Bones, and I wound up being sacrificed to ensure that it happened. So not very auspicious, but really fun. And compared to the Choose Your Own Adventure style books that I read as a kid, seemed like way more options, way more interactive, adding in the skills and rolling, added an element to it that I didn't know I needed, but it seems way more interesting to be like, instead of just always being able to choose the right things, like, oh, I know I need to do this, but I wasn't lucky this time. So that's it definitely seems like something that would add to the longevity of it. I can definitely see why these books were so popular for so long. And they're still going 40 years later. That's amazing. As a parent, I definitely would love to have these for my kids. I'll definitely be picking up certainly the new ones. So those sound awesome. And I'd love to pick up old ones too. So hopefully Scholastic keeps reprinting older ones too, because they're getting harder and harder to find, it seems like. So hopefully 40 years will turn into 50 years and more. Keep getting these books because they're just fun. And great introductions to role-playing games. So based off the original pitch of make a book that teaches people how to play, this is definitely established. You are role-playing by doing this, by making these choices. You're inhabiting, you are the hero, And then, of course, they're also just good at, oh, no game this week. What? Well, why don't I do this? Like, as I mentioned, I've gone through Blood Bones a handful of times now, and I have no idea what I'm doing still. So definitely one that could entertain me for quite some time, trying to figure out where exactly do I need to go? Because I wound up being imprisoned overnight. I missed the ritual. I got waylaid by a ghost. I think one of them was. I got attacked by this guy who wielded an anchor. But again, still have no idea where I'm actually supposed to go in the adventure, which is great. And I look forward to figuring that one out, getting these new ones. And I might be late to coming to the Fighting Fantasy game, but I'm definitely a fan now because they're just great. They're fun. So thank you very much, Sir Livingstone. He recently got knighted, so Sir Livingstone and Mr. Jackson. And this will definitely not be the last you hear about those two. I definitely want to do an episode on Games Workshop in general. They've got a book coming out soon about the history of that company, so that'll be interesting. Warhammer is definitely on my list to hit. I'm not sure. I didn't see much interplay between them and Warhammer, but of course they made the company who made it, so definitely expect more for those two in the future on this podcast. But thank you very much for listening. This has been Eldritch History. My name is Jacob Tomlinson Korst. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it with a friend. So until next time, may you always make your saving throw, and may your stamina never fail.